When officials slapped a condemnation notice on the cliffside cabin, everyone expected the elderly couple to leave quietly, but what they found hidden in the walls would expose a 70-year cover-up and change their lives forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning mist clung to Pine Bluff like a secret refusing to be told. Merrick stood on the weathered deck of his cabin, calloused hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, staring out at the valley below. At 73 years old, he'd learned to read the mountains the way some men read newspapers. Every ridgeline, every shadow had meaning. And this morning, something felt wrong. The air carried weight it shouldn't. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear Opal humming while she made breakfast. After 49 years of marriage, her voice still settled something restless in his chest. She was 71 now, silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn since her librarian days, reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose. They'd retired to this place 30 years ago when the world still made sense, when a fixed income could stretch, when nobody bothered you if you paid your taxes and kept to yourself. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. Rough-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind blew wrong, windows that rattled in their frames. But it was theirs. Perched on the edge of the cliff, overlooking what locals called the Ridgemont Valley, it offered a view that stopped hearts and started conversations. On clear days, you could see for 30 miles. Merrick had bought the property for almost nothing back in 1994. Nobody else wanted it. Too remote, too run down, too close to the edge. The real estate agent had practically begged him to reconsider, but Merrick had known the moment he saw it. The cabin had been built in the 1930s by a man named Caleb Whitmore, a hermit who'd spent his final years carving a life from stone and timber at the world's edge. When Caleb died in 1992, the property sat abandoned for 2 years before Merrick and Opal found it. They'd spent their savings fixing it up, making it livable. Opal had turned the small second bedroom into a reading nook filled with books she'd collected over a lifetime. Merrick had built a workshop in the lean-to shed, filling it with tools and half-finished projects that gave his hands something to do in retirement. Their Social Security checks barely covered expenses, but they'd learned to make do. Opal grew vegetables in raised beds she'd convinced Merrick to build. He hunted deer in season, fished the streams that cut through the forest. They heated with wood Merrick cut and split himself, each log a small victory against the cold. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace. They'd chosen quiet over comfort and never regretted it. Until that Thursday morning in late September when the white government sedan crawled up their gravel drive. Opal noticed it first. "Merrick?" she called from the kitchen window, her voice carrying an edge he recognized. Concern, maybe fear. "Someone's coming." Visitors were rare. The drive from the main road took 40 minutes. 20 of those on a dirt track that destroyed suspension systems and tested patience. People didn't just drop by. Merrick set down his coffee and moved to the window, squinting against the morning glare. The sedan stopped near their truck, and 2 people emerged. A man in his 40s wearing a suit that screamed bureaucrat, and a woman about the same age carrying a leather briefcase. They moved with the careful precision of people delivering bad news. Merrick met them at the door before they could knock. "Morning," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Something in their faces told him pleasantries were pointless. "Mr. Merrick Henderson?" the man asked, already knowing the answer. He pulled out identification. "I'm Philip Graves from the Bureau of Land Management. This is Janet Reynolds, County Assessor's Office. May we come in?" Opal appeared beside Merrick, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "What's this about?" Graves and Reynolds exchanged a look, the kind of look that made Merrick's stomach drop. He'd seen that look before, decades ago, when the factory foreman had gathered everyone to announce the plant was closing. The look that said your life is about to change and there's nothing you can do about it. Perhaps we should sit down, Reynolds suggested. They moved to the small dining table, Opal clearing away breakfast dishes with quick, nervous movements. Merrick stayed standing, arms crossed. Whatever they had to say, he'd hear it on his feet. Graves pulled documents from his briefcase, spreading them across the table like evidence at a trial. Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson, we're here regarding your property, specifically regarding the land underneath this structure and approximately 300 acres surrounding it. What about it? Merrick asked. There's been a rezoning initiative, Graves said, his tone practiced, rehearsed. The Ridgemont Valley Development Project. It's a comprehensive plan to address flooding concerns, create recreational opportunities, and provide water resources for the growing population in Cascade County. Opal's hand found Merrick's. Her fingers were cold. What does that have to do with us? She asked, though Merrick suspected she already knew. Reynolds opened a folder, revealing maps marked with red boundaries. Your property falls within the designated flood zone. The plan calls for the construction of a dam approximately 2 miles downstream from here. Once completed, the valley will be converted into a reservoir. The water level will rise to... She traced a line on the map with her finger, approximately 50 feet below your current elevation. So we're safe then, Merrick said, knowing it wasn't that simple. The cabin itself won't flood, Graves admitted, but the access road will be completely submerged. You'll have no way in or out except by boat. More critically, geological surveys indicate that the saturation of the surrounding soil will compromise the cliff stability. This structure sits approximately 40 feet from the edge. Within 5 years of the reservoir filling, engineers estimate a 70 to 80% probability of catastrophic cliff failure. The words hung in the air like smoke. Opal's grip on Merrick's hand tightened. You're saying our home is going to fall into the lake, she said quietly. We're saying, Reynolds interjected, her voice softer than Graves', that the risk is too significant. The county has issued a condemnation order. For your safety, you'll need to vacate the property within 90 days. Merrick laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. Vacate, just like that. Pack up 30 years of our lives and go where exactly? Graves pulled out another document. The county is offering fair market compensation. Based on the assessor's evaluation, we're prepared to offer $47,000 for the land and structure. $47,000, Merrick repeated, the number ridiculous in his mouth. We paid $32,000 for this place in '94. You're telling me 3 decades of improvements, 3 decades of memories, 3 decades of our lives is worth an extra $15,000. The property value is impacted by its remote location and the pending condemnation, Reynolds explained. We've used comparable sales data from similar properties in flood zones. It's a fair assessment. Fair, Opal whispered, and something in her voice made Merrick's heart crack. She'd found her courage in this place, her peace. The library had chewed her up, burned her out with budget cuts and changing priorities, and parents who treated her like a glorified babysitter. This cabin had given her back the parts of herself the world had taken. What if we refuse? Merrick asked, already knowing. Graves gathered his papers with bureaucratic efficiency. Then, in 90 days, the sheriff's department will execute the eviction order. You'll be removed from the property and the structure will be demolished as a safety hazard. Either way, you're leaving. This way, you get compensated. They left the documents on the table like sentence papers, climbed back into their white sedan, and disappeared down the gravel drive. Merrick and Opal stood in the doorway, watching the dust settle, holding hands like teenagers facing the end of summer. What do we do? Opal asked. Merrick didn't have an answer. The next 3 weeks passed in a fog of phone calls and dead ends. Merrick contacted lawyers, but the ones who'd take his case wanted retainers he couldn't afford, and the ones he could afford told him the same thing. Eminent domain is nearly impossible to fight. especially when public safety concerns are involved. The county had done their homework. The project had been approved by 3 different agencies. Environmental impact studies had been filed, public comment periods completed. It was, in every legal sense, a done deal. Opal spent her days sorting through their belongings, deciding what they could take and what they'd have to abandon. Each item carried weight. The rocking chair Merrick had refinished for their 30th anniversary. The quilts she'd made from fabric scraps collected over decades. The photographs documenting a life lived fully, if not grandly. $47,000 wouldn't get them another house, not anymore. Maybe a down payment on a small place, if they could find someone willing to mortgage to people in their 70s. More likely, they'd end up in some retirement community, a 1-bedroom apartment with thin walls and neighbors too close and rules about everything. Merrick couldn't accept it. He'd spent his whole life following rules, playing by the book, doing what he was told. Work hard, save money, don't make trouble. And where had it gotten him? Watching everything he'd built get taken away by people in suits who saw him as a line item on a budget report. He started spending more time in the cabin, really looking at it. Caleb Whitmore had built this place to last. The logs were old-growth timber, dense and solid. The foundation was stone-quarried from the mountain itself. The man had been a craftsman, someone who understood that if you're going to build something at the edge of the world, it better be strong enough to survive there. One evening, while Opal was in town getting groceries, Merrick went down to the workshop. He needed to move some of his tools, start figuring out what he could sell and what he'd have to leave behind. The shed was cramped, filled with decades of accumulated equipment. He'd built shelving along the walls, but it was never quite enough. He started pulling down boxes, sorting through saw blades and drill bits and half-empty paint cans. That's when he noticed it. The back wall of the shed butted up against the cabin's exterior. Merrick had always assumed it was solid, just the log wall of the main structure. But as he moved a heavy toolbox, his shoulder bumped against one of the logs and it shifted. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough. He set down the toolbox and pressed his palm against the log. It moved again, rocking slightly in its frame. Curious now, Merrick grabbed a flashlight and examined the wall more carefully. The chinking between the logs, that mixture of mud and moss that sealed the gaps, it was different here. Newer, or rather older, but different. A different color, different texture. He pulled out his pocket knife and scraped at the chinking. It flaked away easily, too easily. Behind it, instead of solid log, his knife hit metal. Merrick's pulse quickened. He scraped more chinking away, revealing a vertical strip of dark metal running between 2 logs. It took him another 20 minutes to clear enough chinking to understand what he was looking at. The logs weren't solid, they were cut, creating a panel maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The metal strips were hinges, old and rusted, but still intact, and at the edge, hidden beneath layers of dried mud and time, was a latch. He tested it gently. Stuck, obviously, after decades undisturbed. He went back to his workbench, found some penetrating oil, soaked the latch mechanism. Gave it 10 minutes, tried again. This time it moved, grinding against corrosion, fighting him, but moving. With a sound like a sigh, the panel swung inward, hinges protesting, revealing darkness beyond. Merrick shined his flashlight into the gap. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of stone and earth and something else, something papery and old. The light revealed a space between the cabin's outer wall and an inner wall he'd never known existed. Maybe 3 feet wide, running the length of the cabin. And filling that space, stacked floor to ceiling, were boxes. He squeezed through the gap, flashlight in hand, and found himself in a hidden corridor that ran behind the entire back wall of the cabin. The boxes were wooden crates, the kind military surplus stores sold, stamped with faded letters he couldn't read. There must have been 50 of them, maybe more, stacked with military precision. Merrick pulled the nearest crate toward him. It was lighter than expected, and when he pried open the lid with his knife, he found it packed with papers, files, documents sealed in old plastic bags that had gone brittle with age. He pulled one out, careful not to tear the fragile plastic, and angled his flashlight to read. The letterhead said United States Army Corps of Engineers. The date was January 1953. The subject line made his blood cold. Ridgemont Valley Survey, Preliminary Acquisition Phase. He pulled out another document. Same letterhead, different date. May 1953. Environmental Assessment, Minimal Impact Projection. Another one. September 1953. Residential Displacement Estimate, Acceptable Losses. Merrick's hands started shaking. He opened another crate. More files, more documents, but also photographs. Black and white images of the valley as it had been before whatever had happened. Houses dotting the hillsides, a small church with a white steeple, what looked like a schoolhouse, streets lined with trees, people standing in front of businesses, smiling at the camera, unaware that someone was already planning to take it all away. Another crate held maps, detailed topographical surveys showing every structure in the valley, each building marked with a number. In the margins, handwritten notes: acquired, relocated, demolished, and in several cases, a single word that made Merrick's stomach turn: flooded. He pulled out his phone, the signal weak but present, and started taking pictures. Every document, every photo, every map. His hands were steady now, driven by something beyond fear or anger. This was evidence. Proof. Of what exactly, he wasn't sure yet, but it meant something. When Opal's truck rumbled up the drive an hour later, Merrick was still in the hidden corridor, surrounded by decades of secrets. He heard her call his name, heard the worry in her voice when he didn't answer. He backed out of the gap, covered in dust and cobwebs, and found her standing in the workshop doorway, grocery bags in hand, eyes wide. "Merrick, what on earth?" He took her hand, led her to the opening, showed her the hidden space and its contents. "Opal," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. "I think Caleb Whitmore left us something someone didn't want found." They spent the next 3 days cataloguing everything. Opal, with her librarian's training, created a systematic inventory. They found 73 crates in total, each one filled with documents related to something called the Ridgemont Valley Project, but not the current project Graves and Reynolds had described, an older one, much older. The documents told a story that made their current situation suddenly make terrible sense. In 1952, the Army Corps of Engineers had surveyed the Ridgemont Valley for a dam project. Not for flood control or recreation, but for a military installation. The documents referenced a classified facility, something to do with weapons testing, something they didn't have clearance to fully understand. But the project required flooding the valley, and that meant relocating everyone who lived there. The files showed hundreds of families, a whole community. The Corps had promised fair compensation, promised to help people relocate, promised new homes and new opportunities. The photographs showed government officials shaking hands with valley residents at community meetings, smiling, reassuring. But then the documents changed. Reports of acquisition complications, families refusing to sell, property values disputed, and then, in late 1953, a shift in tone. New orders came down from Washington. The project was classified as critical to national security. Eminent domain proceedings accelerated. Compensation offers were slashed. Families were given 30 days to vacate. What happens next will reveal just how far governments will go to bury their mistakes and remind us why some secrets refuse to stay hidden. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The most damning documents were dated January through March of 1954. Eviction notices, sheriff's reports, and then a series of memos marked confidential, that made Opal gasp when she read them. Residents who refused to leave weren't just evicted. They were arrested on fabricated charges, trespassing on government property, interfering with national defense, resisting federal orders, entire families torn apart, parents sent to federal holding facilities, children placed in state custody, and then the fires started. According to the reports, several valley residents chose to burn their own homes rather than let the government take them. Except the documents contradicted that. Fire marshal reports noted inconsistent burn patterns. Witness statements mentioned unmarked vehicles. Photographs showed federal agents standing near burning structures. The official story said the residents had destroyed their own property in protest. The evidence suggested something darker. By April of 1954, the valley was empty. Every home demolished or burned. Every resident relocated, compensated with a fraction of what they'd been promised, silenced with threats about national security and consequences of speaking out. The dam construction began in May, but then something happened. The memos grew frantic. June 1954. Project complications. July. Engineering reassessment required. August. Geological concerns. September. Cost projections exceeded. In October of 1954, the project was cancelled, not temporarily, permanently. The dam construction was only 30% complete when orders came to halt everything. The official reason, according to one document, was budgetary reallocation due to changing defense priorities. But the engineering reports told a different story. The geology was unstable. The dam, if completed, would have catastrophic structural issues. It would fail, probably within a decade, and when it failed, it would kill everyone downstream. They destroyed an entire community, traumatized hundreds of families, built a dam that could never work, and then they just stopped. Filled in the foundation, left the valley to flood naturally from seasonal runoff, and walked away. And then they'd buried the evidence. The final documents in the collection were the most revealing. A series of orders from 1955 directing the destruction of all files related to the Ridgemont Valley project. Every copy, every memo, every photograph. Burned, shredded, erased. The project was to be struck from all records. Anyone who'd worked on it was transferred to other assignments with strict non-disclosure agreements. The valley itself was to be listed as previously uninhabited wilderness on all future maps and surveys. But someone hadn't followed orders. Someone had gathered all these documents, stored them, hidden them, and Merrick had a pretty good idea who. He found confirmation in the last crate, a personal journal, leather-bound and water-stained, belonging to Caleb Whitmore. The entries started in 1952 when Caleb had been a young engineer working for the Corps. He'd been part of the survey team, one of the people who'd walked through the valley taking measurements, meeting residents, assuring them everything would be fine. The journal entries chronicled his growing horror as the project progressed, the lies he was told to tell, the families he watched get destroyed, the orders he received that went against every engineering principle he'd learned. He'd objected, filed official complaints, tried to go through proper channels. For his trouble, he'd been reassigned, demoted, eventually forced into early retirement with threats about what would happen if he ever spoke publicly about Ridgemont Valley. So he'd done something else. Before the document destruction order was executed, he'd made copies, spent months gathering every file he could access, photographing documents, collecting evidence. And then he'd built this cabin, built it with a secret space specifically designed to preserve what he'd saved. He'd spent the rest of his life here, guarding his archive, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. That moment never came. He died in 1992, and his secret died with him. Until now. Merrick sat at the dining table, surrounded by 70 years of buried truth, and looked at the condemnation notice Graves had left behind. The new dam project, the comprehensive plan, the public safety concerns. It all felt sickeningly familiar. Different year, different excuse, same result. Flood the valley, erase the past, silence anyone who objects. Except this time they had leverage. Opal was thinking the same thing. She looked up from the journal she'd been reading, her eyes bright with something Merrick recognized. Determination. His librarian wife, who'd spent decades fighting for truth and access to information, had found her battle. "We can't let them do this again," she said quietly. "No," Merrick agreed. "We can't." "But how do we stop them? We don't have lawyers, we don't have money, we don't have—" "We have this," Merrick interrupted, gesturing at the documents spread across every surface. "We have proof that they lied before, proof that they destroyed lives, proof that they buried their mistakes and pretended none of it happened." "Will anyone care?" Opal asked. "It was 70 years ago. Everyone involved is probably dead." "The families aren't dead," Merrick said. "The children who lost their homes, who watched their parents get arrested, who got told they were interfering with national defense when all they wanted was to keep their houses. Those children are in their 70s and 80s now, same as us, and they deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know it wasn't their fault, wasn't their parents' fault, that their government lied to them and then tried to pretend it never happened." Opal nodded slowly. "So we tell the story." "We tell the story," Merrick confirmed, but telling the story required more than just having documents. They needed someone who could understand what they'd found, verify its authenticity, and help get it in front of people who mattered. Merrick had been a machinist, not an investigative journalist. Opal knew books, not bureaucracy. They needed help. Merrick thought about the reporter who'd covered the condemnation notice in the local paper, a young woman named Sarah Chen who'd seemed genuinely outraged on their behalf. He found her business card in the pile of papers on the counter, stared at it for a long moment, then picked up the phone. Sarah answered on the third ring. "Chen? Miss Chen, this is Merrick Henderson. You interviewed me last week about the cabin condemnation?" "Mr. Henderson, yes, of course. Has there been a development?" Merrick looked at the documents covering his table, thought about Caleb Whitmore spending 40 years guarding this secret, thought about all the families whose stories had been erased. "You could say that," he said. "How would you feel about breaking the biggest story of your career?" Sarah Chen arrived at the cabin 3 hours after Merrick's call, driving up the gravel road in a beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better days. She was younger than Merrick expected, maybe 32 or 33, with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail and the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. She carried a weathered messenger bag and a digital recorder, and when Opal offered her coffee, she accepted with the gratitude of someone who'd been running on caffeine and determination for too long. Merrick led her to the dining room table, where they'd laid out a representative sample of the documents. The rest remained in the hidden corridor, preserved exactly as they'd found them. Sarah set down her coffee, pulled out a notebook, and went very still. "Walk me through it," she said quietly, "from the beginning." So they did. Merrick explained finding the hidden panel, the corridor, the crates. Opal showed her the inventory they'd created, the systematic organization of 73 crates containing thousands of documents. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes in shorthand that looked like a language unto itself. When they finished, she reached for the first document, a memo from January of 1953, outlining the initial valley survey. She read it carefully, then pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Then another document, then another. Her hands were steady, professional, but Merrick could see something building behind her eyes. "Do you understand what you have here?" she asked after maybe 20 minutes. "We think so," Opal said. "This is proof of forced relocation, document destruction, and government cover-up spanning 7 decades, Sarah said. This is proof that they destroyed an entire community for a military project they knew was geologically unsound, then erased all record of it ever happening." She looked up at them. This is Pulitzer-level journalism. This is the kind of story that ends careers and starts congressional investigations. Can you verify it? Merrick asked. The documents, I mean. Make sure they're real? Sarah nodded slowly. I have contacts, historians, archivists, people who specialize in government documents from this era. The letterheads alone tell me these are likely authentic. The paper stock, the typewriter fonts, the bureaucratic language, it all tracks for 1950s federal documents. But yes, we need verification. And we need corroboration. Corroboration? Opal asked. We need to find the people, Sarah explained. The families who were displaced. If even one person can confirm what's in these documents, can provide first-hand testimony that matches the written record, then we have an airtight case. But that was 70 years ago, Merrick said. Most of them would be in their 70s and 80s, Sarah finished. Same age as you, old enough to remember, hopefully still alive to tell their stories. She pulled out her laptop, flipped it open. The documents list family names. Let me start with those. She worked for 3 hours straight, barely touching her coffee, fingers flying across the keyboard. Merrick and Opal brought her lunch, which she ate absently while cross-referencing census records, obituaries, property transfers, anything that could track the displaced families. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the documents that had waited so long to be read. Finally, Sarah sat back. I've found 12 families, 12 sets of descendants still living within 100 miles of here. Most relocated to Cascade Falls after the eviction. Some scattered farther, but their children stayed in the area. She looked at Merrick and Opal. I need to contact them. Ask if they're willing to talk, if their parents or grandparents ever mentioned what happened in Ridgemont Valley. Do you think they will? Opal asked. Talk, I mean, after all this time? Sarah's expression hardened. I think people who've been silenced for 70 years will jump at the chance to finally tell the truth. She was right. The first person Sarah contacted was a woman named Dorothy Miller, 81 years old, living in a nursing home in Cascade Falls. Her parents had owned a general store in Ridgemont Valley. According to the documents, they'd been among the last holdouts, refusing to sell until federal marshals had physically removed them from the property. Her father had been arrested for interference with national defense operations and held for 6 weeks before being released without charges. Dorothy agreed to meet them the next day. The Cascade Falls nursing home smelled like industrial cleaner and overcooked vegetables, the fluorescent lights too bright, everything too sterile. Dorothy Miller sat in a wheelchair by the window of the common room, a crocheted blanket across her lap, her white hair carefully curled. When Sarah introduced herself and explained why they'd come, Dorothy's hands started shaking. You found proof? She whispered. Actual proof? Merrick opened his briefcase and pulled out copies of the documents related to her family, the acquisition notices, the eviction order, the arrest report for her father. Dorothy took them with trembling fingers, and tears started rolling down her weathered cheeks. My whole life, she said, her voice breaking, my whole life people told me I remembered it wrong, that the valley was wilderness before the government bought it, that my parents made up stories about being forced out, that it never happened the way I remembered. She pressed the documents to her chest. But it did happen. It happened exactly the way I remembered. Sarah turned on her recorder. Mrs. Miller, would you be willing to tell us what you remember for the record? Dorothy nodded and began to speak. She remembered being 8 years old when the men in suits first came to the valley, remembered her father shouting at them to leave, her mother crying in the kitchen, remembered the promises that turned into threats, the neighbors who took the money and left, the ones who stayed and fought. She remembered the night federal agents came with trucks and guns, the way they threw furniture into the yard, the way her father was handcuffed and dragged away while she screamed. She remembered living in a tent city with other displaced families for 3 months while her mother worked 2 jobs to save enough for a new home. She remembered starting school in Cascade Falls and being told by teachers that she shouldn't talk about where she came from, that it was classified, that asking questions could get her mother in trouble. "They made us ashamed," Dorothy said, "ashamed of our own history, ashamed of our parents for fighting back. They made us feel like we'd done something wrong, when all we did was exist in a place the government decided it wanted." By the time she finished, Sarah had filled 30 pages in her notebook. Opal was crying quietly. Merrick felt a rage building in his chest, unlike anything he'd experienced before. This was what Graves and Reynolds were trying to do again. Silence people, erase history, pretend the lives they destroyed didn't matter. Sarah interviewed 11 more people over the next week. Each one told a similar story. Families ripped apart, homes destroyed, lives derailed, and then decades of being told it never happened, that they misremembered, that they should be grateful the government had compensated them at all. Several still had nightmares about the evictions. One man, 76 years old, broke down describing how his father had never recovered from losing the farm that had been in their family for 4 generations. How he'd died bitter and broken, convinced he'd failed to protect what mattered. Each interview was documented, recorded, verified. Sarah cross-referenced their testimony against the documents Merrick and Opal had found, and everything matched. Names, dates, locations, events. The written record and the living memory aligned perfectly, creating a narrative that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. While Sarah gathered testimony, Merrick sent photographs of select documents to 3 independent experts Sarah had recommended. A historian specializing in 1950s federal land policy, an archivist from the National Archives familiar with Army Corps of Engineers paperwork, a forensic document examiner who could verify paper stock, ink composition, and typewriter analysis. All 3 came back with the same conclusion: authentic. The documents were genuine government records from the 1950s, exactly what they appeared to be. The historian went further, confirming that the Ridgemont Valley project had indeed existed, had indeed been cancelled, and had indeed been systematically erased from official records. 2 weeks after Sarah's first visit to the cabin, she returned with a draft of her article. It was devastating. 12,000 words documenting the entire scope of the cover-up, illustrated with reproductions of key documents and photographs from Caleb Whitmore's archive, testimony from 12 survivors, expert verification. A point-by-point comparison between the original Ridgemont Valley project and the current dam proposal, highlighting the uncomfortable parallels. "I want to run this in the Cascade Falls Sentinel," Sarah said, "but I also want to send it to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and ProPublica. This is too big for just local coverage, and I want to release the full document archive online. Make it available to researchers and journalists and anyone who wants to verify the truth for themselves." "Won't that put a target on your back?" Opal asked. Sarah's smile was sharp. "They already put a target on my back when they tried to take your home for a project based on the same lies they told 70 years ago." The story broke on a Tuesday morning. The Cascade Falls Sentinel ran it as their front page, the entire first section dedicated to Sarah's investigation. By noon, the Washington Post had picked it up. By evening, it was trending on social media. By the next morning, it was national news. The response was immediate and explosive. The Bureau of Land Management issued a statement denying any connection between the current dam project and the historical Ridgemont Valley project. They claimed the similarities were coincidental, that modern engineering and environmental standards made the comparison invalid. County officials echoed the denial, insisting their project was about flood control and public safety, nothing more. But the denials rang hollow against the weight of evidence. The documents were public now, available for anyone to review. The testimony of survivors was recorded, preserved, impossible to dismiss. Journalists descended on Cascade Falls like locusts, interviewing everyone involved, digging into county records, requesting information through Freedom of Information Act filings. What happens next will show just how far people in power will go to protect their agenda and remind us why transparency matters more than convenience. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. And then the pressure started. Philip Graves showed up at the cabin on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after Sarah's article published. This time he came alone. No Janet Reynolds, no bureaucratic pleasantries. He looked tired, angry, cornered. "You've made things very complicated," he said without preamble. Merrick met him at the door, didn't invite him in. "We told the truth. If that's complicated, maybe you should examine your project." "The current dam proposal has nothing to do with what happened in the 50s, Graves insisted. "We've done extensive geological surveys. We've held public comment periods. We've followed every regulation." "Just like they did 70 years ago," Merrick shot back. "Right up until the dam started failing and they had to abandon it. How long until your dam fails, Mr. Graves? 5 years? 10? And what happens to all the people downstream when it does?" Graves' jaw tightened. "Our engineering is sound." "Prove it," Merrick said. "Release your geological surveys. Let independent engineers review them. Submit to the same level of scrutiny you're demanding we accept." "That's proprietary information." "That's what they said in 54, Merrick interrupted. "National security, classified, proprietary. Just different words for the same thing. We don't want you to know what we know because it'll prove we're wrong." Graves stood there for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "There are people very invested in this project. People who don't appreciate complications. I'm trying to help you understand that continuing to fight this could have consequences." "Is that a threat?" Opal asked, appearing beside Merrick. "It's a reality check," Graves said. "You've told your story. You've exposed what happened. Congratulations. But the condemnation order still stands. You still have to leave. The dam project is still approved. Nothing has actually changed except now there are cameras and reporters making everything more difficult." "For you," Merrick noted. "For everyone," Graves corrected. "This could have been simple. Now it's a circus." He pulled out his phone, showed them a news article. "Congressman Morrison has called for a federal investigation into historical land seizure practices. Senator Hayes wants oversight hearings. The governor's office is demanding an independent review of all current dam projects in the state. Do you understand what you've triggered?" "Accountability?" Opal suggested. Graves ignored her, focusing on Merrick. "Here's what's going to happen. The county is withdrawing the current condemnation order. You get to stay in your cabin." Merrick felt his heart skip. "What's the catch?" "We're redesigning the project, moving the dam site 3 miles downstream. The water level will be lower, the access road won't flood, and geological surveys show stable cliff conditions. You'll be landlocked between government property, but you'll be safe." "And in exchange?" Merrick asked, knowing there had to be more. "In exchange, you stop talking to reporters. You stop campaigning against the dam. You let this die down. We give you what you want. You give us permission to move forward." "What about the families?" Opal asked. "The people who were forced out in the 50s. What about justice for them?" "What justice?" Graves asked. "It was 70 years ago. Everyone responsible is dead. You want us to apologize? Fine. The Bureau of Land Management officially regrets the hardship caused to families displaced during the original Ridgemont Valley project. We acknowledge that mistakes were made. We commit to ensuring modern projects meet higher standards. Is that enough?" "No," Merrick said flatly. Graves blinked. "No?" "An apology isn't justice," Merrick said. "You erased an entire community from history. You traumatized children who grew into adults believing they'd imagined their own past. You destroyed lives and buried the evidence and pretended none of it happened. And now you want us to be quiet because you've been embarrassed, because exposing the truth is inconvenient. What do you want? Graves asked, frustration bleeding into his voice. Merrick looked at Opal. They'd talked about this late into the night, weighing options and consequences. They'd found something bigger than their cabin, bigger than their personal fight. They'd found a responsibility. We want a memorial, Opal said, in the valley, acknowledging what happened, naming the families who were displaced, telling the true history. We want the documents in Caleb Whitmore's archive donated to the National Archives and the State Historical Society, preserved and accessible to researchers. We want the county to establish a fund compensating the descendants of displaced families for the losses their parents and grandparents suffered, and we want an independent geological review of your dam project, conducted by engineers with no financial stake in its approval. Graves laughed, the sound bitter. You're asking for millions of dollars and political suicide for every county official involved in the current project. It'll never happen. Then the fight continues, Merrick said simply. Graves left without another word. But the offer had been made, and its existence changed things. Sarah wrote a follow-up article detailing the county's proposal and Merrick and Opal's counter-demands. The story went viral again. Suddenly, people across the country were weighing in. Environmental groups, historical preservation societies, civil liberties organizations. Petitions started circulating. Protests were organized. The political pressure became unbearable. Congressman Morrison, sensing an opportunity, launched a formal investigation into federal land management practices, using Ridgemont Valley as the centerpiece. Senator Hayes introduced legislation requiring independent review of all dam projects receiving federal funding. The governor, facing an election year, publicly called for the county to negotiate in good faith with the Henderson family and the descendants of displaced valley residents. Merrick and Opal's cabin became a symbol. News crews camped on their property, interviewing them about David versus Goliath, about standing up to power, about the importance of remembering history. They didn't ask for the attention, didn't particularly want it, but they understood its value. Every camera, every article, every social media post was protection against being silently swept aside. Dorothy Miller became the face of the displaced families. At 81, sharp-minded and articulate, she gave interviews from her wheelchair describing what it meant to finally be believed, to have her memories validated, to know her parents hadn't been wrong to fight back. Other survivors joined her, 12 voices united in demanding recognition and restitution. The county held emergency meetings. The Bureau of Land Management scrambled to distance itself from the controversy. Environmental groups filed lawsuits challenging the dam's approval. Geologists began publicly questioning the project's engineering data, a cascade of scrutiny that couldn't be ignored or deflected. 6 weeks after Graves' visit, Janet Reynolds called and asked if she could come to the cabin to talk. This time, she came alone, no official capacity, no government sedan. She drove up in a personal car and knocked on the door like a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. Opal made tea. They sat at the dining table where this had all started, where documents had first been spread, where truth had first been organized and understood. The county board met last night, Reynolds said quietly. We voted to accept your terms. All of them. Merrick set down his teacup carefully. All of them? Reynolds nodded. The memorial will be built in the spring. The County Historical Society is working with the National Archives to properly preserve and catalogue Caleb Whitmore's collection. We're establishing a compensation fund with an initial allocation of $5 million for displaced families and their descendants. And we're commissioning an independent geological review of the dam project. Why? Opal asked. Why now? Reynolds smiled sadly. Because we lost. Not just the political fight, but the moral one. Because 12 elderly survivors went on national television and described being 8 years old and watching their homes burn while men in uniforms stood by and did nothing. Because Congressman Morrison subpoenaed our internal communications and found emails discussing managing the historical narrative and minimizing displacement optics. Because an independent journalist named Sarah Chen did her job better than we did ours, and now the whole country knows what we tried to hide. She pulled out a folder, slid it across the table. This is the preliminary report from the Geological Review. It's not public yet, won't be for another month, but I thought you should see it. Merrick opened the folder and read. The engineering firm's conclusion was devastating. The proposed dam site had significant geological instability, fractures in the bedrock that previous surveys had either missed or minimized. The dam could be built, but the risk of failure within 10 to 20 years was deemed unacceptably high. The recommendation was clear: abandon the project. We're going to follow that recommendation, Reynolds said. The dam project is cancelled, permanently. Opal's hand found Merrick's. 70 years ago, they'd built a dam that couldn't work, destroyed lives for a project doomed from the start. Now, finally, someone had stopped the pattern from repeating. What about your job? Merrick asked. Speaking out like this, going against the Bureau? Reynolds shrugged. I'm putting in my resignation next week. Going to work with the Historical Society, help them process Caleb's archive. Seems like a better use of my time than displacing people for projects we know are flawed. After she left, Merrick and Opal sat on their deck, watching the sun set over the valley that would stay a valley, that wouldn't be flooded, that would remain wild and free. They'd won, but the victory felt complicated, heavy with the weight of all the people who'd lost this same fight 7 decades earlier. Caleb would be proud, Opal said softly. He knew someone would find it eventually, Merrick agreed. That's why he built that hiding place to last. He was playing the long game. And we finished it for him, Opal said. The phone rang. Sarah calling to tell them the Washington Post wanted to do a feature story. A publisher was interested in a book about the Ridgemont Valley saga. A documentary filmmaker had reached out. The story wasn't over, was maybe just beginning its next chapter. But for now, they had their cabin. They had each other. They had the satisfaction of knowing they'd done something that mattered, something bigger than themselves. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. Sometimes that's everything. The memorial was dedicated 6 months later, on a clear spring morning when the valley bloomed with wildflowers. 200 people attended, including Dorothy Miller and the other survivors, their children and grandchildren, reporters and politicians and ordinary citizens who'd followed the story and wanted to bear witness. The memorial itself was simple but powerful. A curved wall of black granite, 8 feet tall, inscribed with the names of every family displaced from Ridgemont Valley in 1954. 247 names, 247 stories that had almost been erased. At the dedication, Dorothy Miller spoke. For 70 years, we were ghosts. Our history didn't exist in any official record. Our trauma didn't matter. Our loss didn't count. But we existed. We remembered. And now, finally, the world remembers with us. This memorial isn't just about the past. It's about the future. It's a promise that we won't let them erase people ever again. That we'll remember, we'll resist, and we'll demand better. Merrick and Opal stood at the back of the crowd, holding hands, watching history be reclaimed and honored. Caleb Whitmore's name was on the memorial too, at the bottom, with a plaque explaining his role in preserving the truth. The man who'd built their cabin, who'd guarded his secrets for 4 decades, who'd trusted that someday someone would care enough to look. Sarah Chen stood beside them, her camera around her neck, still documenting. She'd won 3 journalism awards for her Ridgemont Valley coverage, had her pick of jobs at major newspapers. She'd turned them all down, chosen to stay at the Cascade Falls Sentinel, committed to local reporting, to being there when the next story needed telling. "What's next for you two?" she asked. Merrick smiled. "We're going to go home to our cabin, plant Opal's garden, and live quietly." "After all this?" Sarah asked. After everything you've accomplished, you're just going back to normal." "This is our normal," Opal said gently. "We never wanted to be crusaders or activists. We just wanted to keep our home. Everything else happened because it had to, because Caleb left us a responsibility we couldn't ignore. But now it's done. The truth is told, the families are honored, the memorial stands. We can rest." And they did. Life after the memorial should have been peaceful. Merrick and Opal had done what they set out to do. The truth was told, the families were honored, their cabin was safe. They'd fulfilled Caleb Whitmore's mission and secured their own future. Everything should have gone back to normal. Except normal had fundamentally changed. The cabin that had once been their private sanctuary had become a landmark. People drove up the gravel road wanting to see where the documents had been hidden, to meet the couple who'd stood up to the government, to touch a piece of living history. Most were respectful, but the sheer volume was overwhelming. Merrick started keeping a log. 12 visitors in the first week after the memorial. 23 the second week. By the third week, they were getting 40 to 50 people showing up unannounced, some with cameras, some with questions, some just wanting to shake their hands and say thank you. Opal tried to be gracious. She'd been a librarian. She understood people's need to connect with stories that moved them. But when a tour bus showed up one Saturday morning carrying 32 tourists from Seattle, she finally put her foot down. "We're not a museum," she told Merrick that evening, her voice strained. "We're people. This is our home." Merrick had already called the county about installing a gate at the bottom of the drive. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd fought to keep their property free from government interference, and now they needed protection from well-meaning strangers who couldn't respect boundaries. But the visitors were the least of it. 3 weeks after the memorial dedication, Merrick received a certified letter from a law firm in Portland. He opened it at the kitchen table while Opal made breakfast, scanned the legal language, and felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" Opal asked, seeing his expression. "We're being sued," he said quietly. The letter explained that a group called the Ridgemont Valley Historical Preservation Alliance had filed suit against Merrick and Opal Henderson, claiming ownership rights to Caleb Whitmore's document collection. Their argument was that the documents pertained to public history, contained information about their ancestors, and therefore should be held in trust by a public entity rather than private individuals. The Alliance's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Vance, had included her contact information with a note suggesting they could settle this amicably if the Hendersons agreed to immediately transfer all documents to the Alliance's custody. Merrick called Sarah Chen. She arrived within 2 hours, read the letter, and started making calls. By evening, she'd assembled a clearer picture of what they were dealing with. The Ridgemont Valley Historical Preservation Alliance had been formed 6 weeks earlier by Malcolm Price, a 68-year-old man whose grandparents had been displaced from the valley in 1954. On the surface, the alliance seemed legitimate. They'd registered as a non-profit, recruited several descendants of displaced families to their board, and publicly stated their mission was to preserve and protect Ridgemont Valley history. But Sarah's digging revealed something else. Malcolm Price had spent the last 30 years as a real estate developer, specializing in what he called heritage properties. He bought historical sites, developed them into tourist attractions, and profited from people's desire to connect with the past. His most successful project had been a former mining town in Colorado that now generated $6 million annually in tourism revenue. "He sees dollar signs," Sarah explained, spreading printouts across the dining table. "The Ridgemont Valley story is national news. People are interested. A museum, a visitor center, maybe a heritage park. He could monetize all of it. But he needs the documents to build the attraction around. Your documents." "Can he win?" Opal asked. "The lawsuit?" Sarah hedged. "It's complicated. You found the documents on your property in a structure you own. That gives you a strong claim. but the documents themselves are government records, technically public property, even if they were illegally concealed, and the families do have a legitimate interest in their own history. "We were going to donate them anyway," Merrick said. "We already agreed with the county to transfer everything to the National Archives and the State Historical Society." "But you haven't done it yet," Sarah pointed out. "The transfer paperwork is still being processed, which means right now, legally, you still possess the documents, and possession is 9/10 of the law. Price knows if he can get a judge to order you to surrender them to his alliance instead of the archives, he controls the narrative, he controls access, he controls everything." Merrick stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the valley. 70 years ago, the government had destroyed a community for a project that never worked. Now, someone wanted to profit from that pain, turn suffering into a tourist attraction. "We fight it," he said. The legal battle consumed the next 4 months. Merrick and Opal couldn't afford the kind of lawyers Malcolm Price had hired, but they didn't have to. When word got out about the lawsuit, offers of pro bono representation flooded in. They chose a firm out of Seattle specializing in cultural heritage law, led by a sharp attorney named Marcus Webb, who'd spent 20 years fighting to repatriate indigenous artifacts from museums. Marcus's strategy was elegant. He didn't dispute that the families had a right to their history. He argued that the proper custodian of that history was the National Archives and State Historical Society, neutral public institutions with no profit motive, not a private alliance controlled by a developer with a track record of commercializing tragedy. He subpoenaed Malcolm Price's business records and discovered that Price had already filed preliminary paperwork to develop a Ridgemont Valley heritage experience, complete with a museum, guided tours, and a gift shop. He'd projected first-year revenue at $4.2 million. When Marcus presented this evidence in court, showing that Price's interest was financial rather than historical, the judge's expression hardened. She asked Price's attorney to explain how commercializing the displacement and suffering of 247 families served the public interest. The attorney couldn't. The judge ruled in Merrick and Opal's favor, stating that while the alliance's concern for historical preservation was noted, the documents would best serve the public interest in the custody of established archival institutions. She ordered the transfer to proceed as originally planned and dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice. Price immediately filed an appeal. What happens next will reveal how some people see profit where others see pain, and remind us why protecting history means protecting it from exploitation. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. But the appeal changed something. Dorothy Miller, now 82, called Merrick 3 days after the judge's ruling. Her voice was tight with anger. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have mentioned before." She explained that Malcolm Price had contacted her 2 months earlier, before forming the alliance. He'd offered her $50,000 to serve as the alliance's public face, to give interviews talking about how important it was for the families to control their own history. Dorothy had declined, uncomfortable with his focus on tourism revenue and gift shop merchandise. When she'd asked how much of the profits would go to the displaced families versus his development company, he'd been evasive. "He's using us," Dorothy said, "using our pain, our history, turning it into a business opportunity, and I won't stand for it." She organized the survivors. All 12 of them, plus dozens of descendants, signed a joint statement supporting Merrick and Opal's decision to donate the documents to public archives. They held a press conference condemning Price's lawsuit as a cynical attempt to profit from tragedy and calling on him to withdraw his appeal. The statement went viral. The optics were devastating for Price. Elderly survivors of government displacement, speaking out against a wealthy developer trying to commercialize their suffering. News outlets ran with it. Price's appeal lost momentum before it even reached the courtroom. 2 weeks later, His attorney quietly withdrew the appeal. The lawsuit was over. But the damage to Price's reputation was permanent. His Ridgemont Valley heritage experience never materialized. The investors pulled out. Within 6 months, he'd sold his development company and moved to Arizona, trying to rebuild his career away from the spotlight of his failed exploitation. Merrick and Opal completed the document transfer in a ceremony at the state capitol. The governor attended, as did Congressman Morrison, Dorothy Miller, and the other survivors, and representatives from the National Archives. Caleb Whitmore's collection was officially preserved, catalogued, and made accessible to researchers and the public. Standing at the podium, holding the final box of documents, Merrick thought about the man who'd assembled this archive. Caleb had died alone in a cabin, his secret intact, trusting that someday it would matter. Now his work was honored at the state capitol, recognized as one of the most significant historical discoveries in Oregon's history. Caleb Whitmore couldn't tell this story in his lifetime, Merrick said to the assembled crowd. But he made sure it could be told. He spent 40 years protecting truth that powerful people wanted buried. And now that truth belongs to everyone, not to profit from, not to exploit, but to learn from, to remember, to ensure it never happens again. The crowd stood and applauded. Opal squeezed his hand. They'd fulfilled their obligation to Caleb, to the families, to history itself. That should have been the end. But 3 months later, a different kind of letter arrived. This one came from Japan, from a woman named Yuki Tanaka. She wrote in careful English, explaining that she was a researcher studying American land seizure policies in the 1950s. She'd read about the Ridgemont Valley discovery and noticed something in the published documents that troubled her. One of the memos Merrick had photographed mentioned consultation with Allied Pacific initiatives regarding the original dam project. Yuki had spent years researching Allied Pacific initiatives, a classified military program from the Korean War era. The program had involved displacing civilian populations in both America and Japan to build military installations, often under false pretenses about flood control or public safety. Yuki believed Ridgemont Valley wasn't an isolated incident. She believed it was part of a larger pattern, and she had evidence of similar projects in California, Washington, and even 2 in Japan. Could she come visit, examine Caleb's archive more thoroughly, cross-reference what she'd found? Merrick called Marcus Webb, their attorney, who advised caution. "You don't have the documents anymore," Marcus pointed out. "They're in the state archives. Any research requests go through them now." But when Merrick forwarded Yuki's letter to the State Historical Society, the archivist called him back within hours. "We need to talk," the archivist said, "because if this researcher is right, what you found isn't just Oregon history, it's potentially an international scandal." Yuki Tanaka arrived in Cascade Falls in late August. She was 56 years old, a professor at Kyoto University, and she carried 3 decades of research in a series of meticulously organized binders. Merrick and Opal met her at the archive, where the Historical Society had set up a research room. Yuki's English was better than her letter suggested. She explained her findings with academic precision, laying out documents that paralleled what they'd discovered in Caleb's archive. Different locations, different justifications, but the same pattern. Allied Pacific initiatives had coordinated displacement projects across multiple countries, always under the guise of military necessity, always with promises of compensation that were never fully honored, always with document destruction orders after the projects were completed or abandoned. Ridgemont Valley was project designation Alpha 7, Yuki explained, pointing to a reference code in one of Caleb's memos. "I have evidence of Alpha 1 through Alpha 12, 8 in the United States, 4 in Japan, all between 1952 and 1956. All resulted in civilian displacement. All were eventually cancelled or abandoned, and all were systematically erased from official records." She pulled out a photograph. A Japanese farming village circa 1953. Families standing in front of traditional homes. This is Shirakawa, population 317. In 1954, they were told the valley needed to be flooded for a hydroelectric project that would support American military bases. They were given 60 days to evacuate. Most were compensated approximately 30% of their property value. The dam was never built. The project was cancelled in 1955. All records were destroyed. She showed them another photograph. The same location, 1960. The village was gone, the valley overgrown, returning to wilderness. 317 people displaced for a project that never existed, and until I started researching 20 years ago, no official record that the village had ever been there. Merrick felt cold. How many people total? Yuki had done the math. Across all 12 projects, approximately 4,700 families displaced. Roughly 18,000 individual people. And those are just the ones I've found documentation for. There may be more. She spent 3 weeks in Cascade Falls, cross-referencing Caleb's documents with her own research. The connections were undeniable. Memos mentioned other project sites. Budget allocations referenced multiple initiatives. Personnel records showed the same engineers and administrators moving between projects. Allied Pacific Initiatives had been a machine for destroying communities, and Ridgemont Valley was just one gear in that machine. Sarah Chen broke the story internationally. The Washington Post ran a 6-part series. Japanese media covered it extensively. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights called for a formal investigation. Historian organizations in 4 countries demanded access to classified records. The political implications were staggering. This wasn't just historical injustice. This was proof of coordinated international displacement policies that had operated in secret for years, destroying thousands of lives, then covering up the evidence. Congressman Morrison expanded his investigation. Senator Hayes introduced legislation requiring declassification of all documents related to Allied Pacific initiatives. The State Department scrambled to manage diplomatic fallout with Japan, where elderly survivors of displacement projects were demanding recognition and compensation. Merrick and Opal watched it unfold from their cabin, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd uncovered. They'd thought they were protecting their home and honoring Caleb Whitmore's legacy. They hadn't realized they were opening a door to something so much larger. Yuki Tanaka became a regular presence in their lives. She'd been fighting this battle for 20 years, mostly alone, dismissed by colleagues who thought she was chasing conspiracy theories. Now, with Caleb's archive validating her research, her life's work was finally being recognized. "You gave me proof," she told Merrick and Opal over dinner one evening. "For 20 years, I had fragments, hints, pieces that suggested something bigger, but I couldn't prove it. Caleb's documents prove it. They show the system, the coordination, the intentionality. They change everything." "What happens now?" Opal asked. Yuki smiled, tired but determined. "Now we find the rest. There are still 8 projects I haven't fully documented. There are survivors in California, Washington, and Japan who deserve to have their stories told. There are government archives in 3 countries that need to be opened. We've started something that won't end in our lifetimes, but maybe our work ensures it ends in someone's." The documentary premiered 10 months after the memorial dedication. The filmmaker, a woman named Jessica Hartford, had spent 8 months interviewing survivors, researching the Allied Pacific Initiatives program, and documenting the broader implications of what Merrick and Opal had discovered. The film was called The Hidden Valley, and it was devastating. It opened with Dorothy Miller describing being 8 years old and watching her home burn. It traced the Ridgemont Valley story from Caleb Whitmore's decision to preserve the documents through Merrick's discovery and the subsequent revelations about the larger displacement program. It ended with Yuki Tanaka in Japan interviewing 90-year-old survivors of the Shirakawa displacement, their stories heartbreakingly similar to the American family's experiences. The documentary won awards. It aired on PBS. It became required viewing in history and political science courses. It sparked congressional hearings and international diplomatic negotiations, and it brought more survivors forward. A woman in California contacted the production team. Her family had been displaced from a valley in Northern California in 1954 for what they were told was a weapons testing facility. The facility was never built. Another man from Washington State. Another woman from Oregon. A family in Hokkaido. Slowly, painfully, the full scope of Allied Pacific initiatives emerged. Merrick and Opal's cabin became an unofficial headquarters for the growing movement. Yuki stored research materials there when she visited. Sarah Chen used their dining table for interviews. Survivors came to meet the couple who'd started it all, to share their own stories, to connect with others who'd lived through similar trauma. The compensation fund the county had established grew. Dorothy Miller's $50,000 settlement was joined by payments to other Ridgemont Valley families. Then California established a similar fund. Washington followed. The Japanese government, under intense political pressure, created a reparations program for displaced communities. It wasn't enough. No amount of money could truly compensate for stolen homes, disrupted lives, decades of trauma and denial. But it was acknowledgement. It was recognition. It was the government finally admitting what it had done. On a cold November morning, 2 years after finding Caleb's documents, Merrick received a call from the National Archives. They'd found something. In the process of cataloging Caleb's collection, archivists had discovered that one of the crates had a false bottom. Underneath the visible layer of documents was another layer, sealed in waterproof containers. Inside those containers were personal items, letters Caleb had written but never sent, a journal detailing his emotional struggle with what he'd witnessed, photographs he'd taken secretly during the displacement process, images the official record claimed didn't exist, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. The archivist read it to Merrick over the phone. Caleb's handwriting, his words, speaking across 7 decades. If you're reading this, then you found what I hid. I'm sorry for the burden I've left you. Carrying the truth is heavy, and I know that weight now passes to you, but you have to carry it. You have to tell the story. Because what they did to these families, what they erased, what they pretended never happened, it matters. Not just as history, but as warning. As proof of what happens when power acts without accountability, when convenience matters more than truth, when the powerful decide that some people's lives simply don't count. I couldn't fight them while I lived. I tried and failed, but I could preserve the evidence. I could trust that someday someone would care enough to look. If you're reading this, you're that someone. Don't waste it. Don't let them bury this again. Make them remember, make them acknowledge, make them better. The families deserve truth. The children who lost their homes deserve validation. The parents who were arrested for protecting their property deserve vindication, and the communities that were erased deserve to be remembered. You have the power now, the power to give voice to the voiceless, to illuminate what was hidden, to demand justice for those who were denied it. Use that power wisely, use it courageously, use it completely. They tried to erase us. Don't let them. Remember. Merrick sat with the phone pressed to his ear long after the archivist finished reading, tears running down his face. Caleb had known. He'd known exactly what he was doing, what he was asking, what burden he was passing on. That evening, Merrick and Opal sat on their deck, watching the sun set over the valley. The tourists had finally stopped coming, deterred by the gate and the clear private property signs. Their lives had returned to something approaching normal, though they both knew normal would never be quite what it was before. "Do you regret it?" Opal asked, "finding the documents, everything that came after?" Merrick thought about the question seriously. The lawsuits, the media attention, the loss of privacy, the weight of responsibility. The elderly survivors crying as they told stories they'd kept buried for 70 years. Yuki Tanaka's 20 years of lonely research finally validated. The thousands of displaced families across 2 countries finally having their pain acknowledged. "No," he said. "I don't regret it. I wish it had been easier, wish we could have just lived quietly in our cabin." But Caleb didn't have the luxury of quiet either, and he made his choice. We made ours. We finished what he started. "What do you think happens next?" Opal asked. Merrick smiled. "Someone else's story. We've done our part. The documents are preserved, the families are recognized, the research is ongoing. Other people can carry it forward now. We get to rest." But rest proved complicated. The following spring, the state legislature passed the Caleb Whitmore Historical Truth Act, requiring all government agencies in Oregon to review their archives for evidence of undocumented displacement projects and to proactively declassify records related to land seizures before 1960. It was named in honor of the man who'd spent 40 years protecting truth the government wanted hidden. Congressman Morrison's federal investigation concluded with a scathing report on Allied Pacific initiatives, documenting the full scope of the displacement program and recommending congressional apologies to affected communities in both the United States and Japan. The House passed a formal apology resolution. The Senate followed. It wasn't justice, not really. You couldn't apologize your way out of destroying thousands of lives. But it was acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement is the foundation everything else gets built on. Dorothy Miller died peacefully in her sleep at age 83, 6 months after the congressional apology. Her obituary mentioned that she'd lived to see her history validated, her memories honored, her family's suffering recognized. She'd spent the last years of her life not as a ghost, but as a witness, finally believed, finally heard. Merrick and Opal attended her funeral. So did Sarah Chen, Yuki Tanaka, Marcus Webb, and 50 other people whose lives had been changed by the Ridgemont Valley story. They stood in the rain outside the church, listening to Dorothy's grandson talk about how much it had meant to his grandmother to finally stop being told she was wrong about her own past. "She used to have nightmares," the grandson said. "Dreams about trying to tell people what happened and having them laugh at her, tell her she imagined it, call her a liar. After the memorial was built, after the truth came out, the nightmares stopped. The last 2 years of her life were the most peaceful she'd ever known. And that's because of people like Merrick and Opal Henderson, like Sarah Chen, like everyone who refused to let the truth stay buried. My grandmother died knowing she'd been right all along. That might not sound like much, but it was everything to her." Standing in that rain, listening to those words, Merrick understood something fundamental. They hadn't just found documents. They'd given people back their histories, their identities, their right to be believed about their own lives. In a world that constantly tells some people their experiences don't matter, that their memories are wrong, that their pain is imaginary, proving the truth is revolutionary. The book came out that fall. Sarah Chen had spent 18 months writing it, documenting the entire saga from Merrick's discovery through the international implications of Allied Pacific initiatives. She called it The Hidden Valley, how one cabin's secret exposed a government cover-up spanning 7 decades and 2 continents. It became a bestseller, appeared on required reading lists, sparked discussions about government accountability, historical memory, and the importance of preserving inconvenient truths. Sarah donated half her royalties to the Ridgemont Valley Compensation Fund. Merrick and Opal attended the book launch in Portland. They sat in the back, uncomfortable with the attention, proud of Sarah's work but ready to let her have the spotlight. But when the moderator asked Sarah who deserved credit for the story, she didn't hesitate. Merrick and Opal Henderson had every reason to take the county's offer and walk away, Sarah said. They could have accepted $47,000, moved to some apartment, and lived out their retirement in peace. Instead, they chose the harder path. They chose truth over convenience, justice over comfort, responsibility over ease. This story exists because they found documents in a hidden corridor, and instead of thinking, "This is weird," they thought, "This is important." Everything that followed, the memorial, the investigation, the international revelations, the compensation, all of it started with two people in their 70s deciding that Caleb Whitmore's secret deserved to be told. They're the heroes of this story, even though they'd never call themselves that. The audience turned to look at them. Merrick felt his face flush. Opal squeezed his hand. They nodded awkwardly and let Sarah continue. On the drive home, Opal said, "Do you feel like a hero?" Merrick laughed. "I feel like someone who found something important and did what any decent person would do with it. That's not heroism. That's just not being a coward." "Maybe that's what heroism is," Opal suggested. "Just not being a coward when it would be easier to be one." They drove in comfortable silence, the Oregon landscape rolling past, familiar and eternal. Their cabin waited for them at the end of that gravel drive, solid and real and theirs. Inside, the hidden corridor stood empty now, its secrets released, its purpose fulfilled. Merrick thought about Caleb Whitmore, dying alone with his archive intact, trusting strangers he'd never meet to do what he couldn't. That took a special kind of courage. The courage to believe in people you'd never know, to invest in a future you wouldn't see, to fight a battle that would outlive you. And Merrick and Opal had honored that courage, had taken Caleb's trust and used it to change the world, just a little, just enough, had given voice to the voiceless and memory to the forgotten, and truth to those who'd been denied it. That night, lying in bed with Opal beside him, Merrick heard the wind in the pines and felt the solid presence of their cabin around them. This place had given them more than shelter. It had given them purpose, meaning, connection to something larger than themselves. Caleb had built this cabin to last, to protect what mattered, to stand against time and weather and those who'd rather forget. And it had done exactly that, was still doing it, would continue doing it long after Merrick and Opal were gone, a testament to one man's refusal to let truth die and two more people's refusal to let him down. Tomorrow, Merrick knew, they'd wake up to their quiet life. Make coffee, tend the garden, watch the valley they'd saved from being flooded. They'd field occasional calls from researchers accessing Caleb's archive, attend ceremonies honoring displaced families, watch as the ripples of their discovery continued spreading outward. But mostly, they'd just live. Read books and split firewood and grow vegetables and love each other through whatever time remained. They'd earned that peace, purchased it with the hardest currency there is, doing the right thing when it would have been easier to do nothing. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us can hope for. To leave the world a little better than we found it, to honor the trust placed in us by those who came before, to care enough about truth to fight for it, even when fighting is hard. Caleb Whitmore had passed them a torch. They'd carried it forward, lit other flames, passed it on. The light would keep spreading, illuminating dark corners, exposing hidden truths, making it just a little harder for powerful people to erase the powerless. That was enough. That was everything. 3 years passed in the quiet way years do when you're not paying attention, when you're content with morning coffee and evening sunsets and the simple rhythm of days that belong to you. Merrick turned 76. Opal turned 74. The cabin settled around them like an old friend, familiar creaks and comfortable silences. The world outside continued the work they'd started. Yuki Tanaka published a comprehensive history of Allied Pacific initiatives, documenting all 12 displacement projects with the kind of academic rigor that turned conspiracy theory into historical fact. The book won international recognition, sparked diplomatic agreements between the United States and Japan, and established reparations programs that would run for decades. Sarah Chen left the Cascade Falls Sentinel, Not for a big city newspaper, but for a non-profit investigative journalism center focused on government accountability. She'd found her calling in the Ridgemont Valley story and spent her career chasing similar cases, exposing similar cover-ups, giving voice to similar forgotten communities. The memorial in the valley became a pilgrimage site, not in the exploitative way Malcolm Price had envisioned, but organically, authentically. Families who'd been displaced came to see their names etched in granite. Historians came to study. Students came to learn. The County Historical Society ran educational programs, teaching each new generation about what had happened, why it mattered, how to prevent it from happening again. Merrick and Opal watched it all from their cabin, satisfied observers of something that had grown beyond them. They gave occasional interviews when researchers needed first-hand accounts, attended anniversary ceremonies when their presence felt important, but mostly they just lived. Opal's garden flourished. She'd expanded the raised beds, added a small greenhouse Merrick built from salvaged windows, cultivated heirloom vegetables she traded with neighbors. The physical work kept her arthritis manageable, gave her hands purpose, connected her to the earth in ways that felt essential. Merrick spent his time in the workshop, though the projects grew simpler as his joints stiffened. He couldn't do heavy carpentry anymore, but he carved. Small wooden birds, animals, abstract shapes that pleased his eye. He gave them away to visitors, to friends, to anyone who seemed like they needed something beautiful and handmade. They were content. They'd fought their battle, won their war, earned their peace. Everything else was epilogue. Until the phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late March. Opal answered because Merrick was outside splitting kindling. The voice on the other end was young, nervous, professional. A woman named Claire Patterson from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Henderson, I'm calling about Caleb Whitmore's archive, specifically about a discovery we've made while digitizing the collection. Opal's pulse quickened. They'd thought all the secrets had been revealed, all the documents examined. What kind of discovery? Claire explained. While scanning documents for the digital archive, a technician had noticed faint markings on several pages. Watermarks, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. When photographed under ultraviolet light, the watermarks revealed additional text. Messages Caleb had embedded in the documents themselves, hiding information within information. We've only decoded about 30 pages so far, Claire said, but what we're finding suggests Caleb Whitmore knew even more than the documents explicitly state. He was embedding commentary, connecting dots between different projects, documenting things he witnessed but couldn't prove with paperwork. It's like he created a parallel archive hidden inside the main archive. Why are you calling us? Opal asked, though she suspected she knew. Because one of the decoded messages mentions you, specifically. It says, to whoever owns this cabin when I'm gone, check the foundation stones on the northeast corner. What's buried there completes the story. Opal's hand tightened on the phone. He left something else? It appears so. We wanted your permission to send a team to investigate. We'd need to excavate, potentially disturb your property. We wouldn't do that without your consent. Opal found Merrick outside, told him about the call. They stood together looking at the northeast corner of the cabin, where stone foundation met earth, where Caleb's final secret apparently waited. He planned it all, Merrick said quietly. The documents in the corridor were just the first layer. He knew we'd find those, knew they'd spark investigation, knew eventually someone would look closer. And this, whatever this is the proof he couldn't include in the main collection. The evidence too dangerous to keep with the rest. They called Claire back and gave permission. The Smithsonian team arrived 1 week later. 3 researchers, 2 technicians, equipment that looked more suited to an archaeological dig than a cabin foundation. They worked carefully, respectfully, documenting every step. It took them 6 hours to find it. Buried 18 inches deep, wrapped in layers of oiled canvas and sealed in a metal box, was a collection of items that changed everything they thought they understood about Caleb Whitmore and his mission. The box contained a classified military file from 1954, marked Eyes Only, with a clearance level that made the researchers' hands shake. Inside were orders. Not the bureaucratic memos about displacement and compensation that filled the corridor archive, but direct orders from the Department of Defense to field commanders. Orders to intimidate residents who refused to leave, orders to fabricate criminal charges against community leaders, orders to use necessary force to clear the valleys, orders to destroy evidence of what they'd done, and signatures. Generals, senators, cabinet members, names that history remembered as statesmen and heroes, their handwriting authorizing the destruction of American communities in the name of national security. But that wasn't the most damning item in the box. There was a photograph, black and white, slightly blurred, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed a meeting in what appeared to be a military office. 8 men in uniform and suits gathered around a table covered with maps. The maps showed all 12 Allied Pacific Initiative's project sites. And written on a chalkboard behind them, visible in the photograph, was a sentence that made Claire Patterson's face go white when she read it. Civilian displacement acceptable, structural failure acceptable, plausible deniability essential. They'd known. The engineers, the generals, the politicians who'd authorized the dam projects, they'd known the dams were geologically unsound. They'd known the projects would fail, and they'd proceeded anyway because the real goal wasn't flood control or military installations. The real goal was land acquisition. Claire pulled out another document from the box. A map showing mineral surveys of all 12 project sites. Every single location, Ridgemont Valley included, sat on top of significant rare earth mineral deposits. Elements critical to weapons manufacturing, electronics, aerospace technology. Elements worth billions of dollars. The displacement projects had been cover stories, pretexts to seize land the government wanted, justify it with national security concerns, then abandon the projects once they had control of the mineral rights. Thousands of families destroyed not even for military necessity but for corporate profit. And Caleb Whitmore had known, had documented it, had kept the most explosive evidence separate from the main archive because releasing it would have destroyed him, would have brought the full weight of the national security apparatus down on his head. So he'd buried it, literally, trusting that someday the political climate would change enough. Enough time would pass. Enough other truth would come out, that this final revelation could be safely exposed. Merrick stood looking at the contents of the metal box spread across his dining table for the second time in 4 years and felt something break inside him. They'd thought they understood the scope of the betrayal. They'd thought they'd uncovered the full truth. But this was different. This wasn't bureaucratic overreach or failed projects or even deliberate displacement. This was conspiracy. This was corruption at the highest levels of government, using national security as cover for theft. "What do we do with this?" he asked quietly. Claire Patterson looked at him seriously. "This is classified material. Technically, possessing it is a federal crime. The Smithsonian has to report this to the Justice Department, and they'll have to decide whether to declassify it or bury it again." "Bury it," Opal said bitterly. "Of course they will, because exposing this means exposing that generals and senators and God knows who else used their power to steal from American citizens." "Maybe," Claire admitted, "but maybe not. Times have changed. There's more transparency now, more accountability, and everything else Caleb documented has already been made public. Suppressing this would just confirm what it reveals." Sarah Chen arrived that evening. Merrick had called her, sent her photos of what they'd found. She drove up from Portland with a lawyer, a constitutional law expert named David Cross, who specialized in classified information cases. David examined the documents carefully, took notes, asked questions. Finally, he sat back. "Here's the situation," he said. "This material is classified, but it's also evidence of criminal activity. There's a legal doctrine called the crime-fraud exception that says classification can't be used to conceal crimes. The problem is proving that what we're looking at actually constitutes crimes and not just morally questionable policy decisions made during the Cold War." "They destroyed communities to steal mineral rights," Merrick said. "They lied about why they were doing it. They covered up evidence. How is that not criminal?" "I agree with you," David said. "But we need to be strategic. If we just release this, the government can claim it compromises national security, prosecute everyone involved, bury it under sealed court orders. If we build a case first, document the crimes, connect it to existing public knowledge, then release it as part of a broader legal action, we have a better chance of forcing transparency." Sarah was already thinking ahead. "We need more than just these documents. We need geologists to confirm the mineral deposits. We need to trace what happened to the land after the projects were abandoned. We need to show that someone profited from this, that it wasn't just a failed policy, but an active theft." Yuki Tanaka arrived 2 days later, summoned by Sarah's urgent message. When she saw what Caleb had buried, she went very quiet. Then she opened her laptop and started pulling up research she'd been sitting on for 5 years, research she hadn't published because she couldn't prove it, couldn't connect the dots tightly enough. She showed them mineral production records from the 1960s and 70s, showed them which mining companies had operated on or near the 12 project sites, showed them the board members and shareholders of those companies, generals who'd retired from the military and taken executive positions, senators who'd left office and joined corporate boards, a web of connections between the people who'd ordered the displacements and the companies that had profited from them. "I've always known this was about resources," Yuki said, "but I couldn't prove the direct connection between the displacement orders and the mining operations. This photograph, these orders, they're the missing link. They show intent, they show coordination, they show that it wasn't just opportunistic corruption, but planned theft." For 2 weeks, Merrick and Opal's cabin became a war room. Researchers worked around the clock, building an airtight case. Geologists confirmed mineral deposits at all 12 sites. Corporate historians traced ownership chains showing how government land seized through the displacement projects had been quietly transferred to private mining interests. Forensic accountants followed money trails showing tens of billions of dollars in profit extracted from land taken under false pretenses. And through it all, the classified photograph and documents sat at the center, the proof that couldn't be ignored or explained away. David Cross filed a lawsuit in federal court, not against the current government, but against the mining companies that had profited from the theft, demanding disgorgement of profits obtained through fraud. The lawsuit included the photograph and documents as evidence, making them part of the public court record. The government moved to seal the documents, claiming national security. David argued the crime-fraud exception. The judge, a 78-year-old woman who'd spent 40 years on the bench, took one look at the evidence and denied the motion to seal. "These documents show that government officials conspired to defraud American citizens of their property under false pretenses of national security," she wrote in her ruling. "Classification does not grant immunity for criminal activity. The public has a right to know what was done in their name." The documents went public. The reaction was explosive. The photograph of military officers and officials planning displacement around a chalkboard admitting structural failure was acceptable, made the front page of every major newspaper. The signatures of respected historical figures on orders to fabricate charges against civilians sparked outrage. The mineral surveys showing the real motivation behind the projects triggered congressional investigations. 3 former mining executives were indicted for fraud. 2 had already died, but the third, 89 years old and still sitting on corporate boards, faced trial. The companies reached settlements, agreeing to pay $5.7 billion into a trust for displaced families and their descendants. and Caleb Whitmore's name was cleared. Because the final document in the metal box, the one they'd almost missed, was Caleb's resignation letter from the Army Corps of Engineers. Not the official resignation in his personnel file, but the real letter, the one he'd actually written before being forced to submit a sanitized version. In it, he detailed everything he'd witnessed, the lies he'd been ordered to tell, the families he'd watched destroyed, the profit motive he'd discovered behind the national security claims. He'd sent the letter to his commanding officer, to the Corps leadership, to his congressional representative, and he'd been threatened with court-martial, with prison, with ruin if he didn't retract it and resign quietly. So he had. But he'd kept a copy, and he'd spent the rest of his life gathering evidence to prove every word of it was true. The Smithsonian added an exhibit about Caleb Whitmore to their American history collection, a small room showing his original resignation letter, photographs from his time with the Corps, examples of the documents he'd preserved, and the metal box that had contained his final testimony. The exhibit was called One Man's Truth: How an Engineer's Conscience Exposed Decades of Deception. Merrick and Opal attended the opening. They stood in that quiet room, reading Caleb's words displayed on museum walls, and felt the weight of connection across time. This man they'd never met, whose cabin they'd bought by accident, whose secret they'd stumbled into, had trusted them completely, had believed that whoever found his work would do the right thing with it. And they had. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but they'd honored his trust, had taken his burden and carried it forward, had finished what he couldn't. "Do you think he knew?" Opal asked quietly, looking at Caleb's photograph on the wall. "That it would take this long? That it would require this many people, this much work?" "I think he hoped," Merrick said, "hoped that truth was patient, that it could wait for the right moment, the right people, the right time, and he was right to hope." They were 80 and 78 years old now, feeling every year in their bones and joints and the way stairs had become mountains. But standing in that museum, seeing Caleb's story honored, seeing the impact of what they'd uncovered ripple through history and lore and collective memory, they felt young, felt purposeful, felt like their lives had added up to something that mattered. The compensation trust changed thousands of lives. Dorothy Miller's children received $273,000, not because money could replace what their mother had lost, but because someone finally acknowledged the loss was real and wrong. Every displaced family received similar recognition. Universities established scholarships in Ridgemont Valley's name. Historical societies preserved the stories. The next generation learned what had been done and why it must never happen again. Merrick and Opal returned to their cabin one last time before everything changed. They knew it was coming, had known for months. Merrick's heart was failing, not dramatically but steadily. The kind of slow decline that gave you time to prepare, but not to fix. The doctors had been clear. He had maybe a year, maybe less. They spent that final autumn in the cabin together, watching leaves turn gold and red, watching storms roll through the valley, watching the world prepare for winter. Opal read to him in the evenings, books they'd loved, books they'd meant to read, books that felt important to share before time ran out. "I want to be buried here," Merrick said one evening, "on the property overlooking the valley. I want to stay with Caleb, watch over what we protected." Opal nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd known he'd ask this, had already made arrangements. The county had granted special permission. Merrick Henderson would rest on the land he'd saved, guardian of truth even in death. He died on a clear December morning, Opal beside him, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped. Peaceful, ready, complete. The funeral was small. Sarah Chen came. Yuki Tanaka flew in from Japan. Marcus Webb attended. Representatives from the Smithsonian, the State Historical Society, the Displaced Families Association. They stood on the cliff edge in winter wind, watching Merrick be lowered into ground he'd fought for, land he'd protected, earth that would hold him forever. Claire Patterson spoke about how Caleb Whitmore had trusted strangers with his truth, and Merrick had proven worthy of that trust. Sarah Chen talked about integrity, about doing what's right even when it's hard. Yuki Tanaka spoke in Japanese first, then English, about how some people change the world without meaning to, just by refusing to look away from injustice. But it was Opal who delivered the eulogy that mattered. "My husband was a machinist," she said, her voice steady despite tears. "He worked with his hands, fixed things, built things, made things that lasted. When we found Caleb's documents, he approached them the same way he approached broken machinery. Studied the problem, understood how the pieces fit together, figured out how to make it work right. He didn't think of himself as a hero or an activist. He thought of himself as someone who'd found something broken and needed to fix it. And he did. Not alone, never alone. But he started it. He made the choice to look closer when it would have been easier to walk away, to care about strangers when he could have focused on himself, to fight for truth when silence was safer. He fixed what was broken, not perfectly, but enough. Enough that Caleb's truth could be told. Enough that thousands of families could be honored. Enough that history could be corrected. That's all he ever wanted, to fix what was broken, to make things right, to leave the world a little better than he found it. And he did. God help me, he really did. They buried him as the sun set over the valley that wouldn't be flooded, the community that wouldn't be forgotten, the truth that wouldn't stay hidden. Caleb Whitmore and Merrick Henderson, two men who'd never met, now resting in the same earth, bound by shared purpose across decades. Opal lived in the cabin another 3 years. She tended the garden, maintained the property, welcomed researchers and visitors who wanted to understand what had happened there. She wrote a memoir not about herself but about Caleb and Merrick, about the men who'd protected truth. The book was called Guardians of the Valley, and it became required reading in ethics courses across the country. When her own health began failing, when living alone on the mountain became impossible, she made a decision. The cabin would become a museum. Not exploitative, not commercial, but educational. A place where people could learn about what happened, why it mattered, how ordinary people could stand against extraordinary power. The Opal Henderson Institute for Historical Accountability opened in her 82nd year. The cabin was preserved exactly as it had been, the hidden corridor left open for visitors to see, the workshop still containing Merrick's tools and half-finished carvings. Guided tours explained the discovery, the documents, the impact. School groups came to learn. Researchers came to study. Survivors came to remember. Opal died peacefully in her sleep at age 83, in a care facility in Cascade Falls, surrounded by photographs of the cabin and the valley and the life she'd built with Merrick. Her last words, according to the nurse who attended her, were, "We finished it. We kept the promise." She was buried beside Merrick on the cliff edge, overlooking the valley they'd saved. 3 graves now. Caleb Whitmore, Merrick Henderson, Opal Henderson. Guardians of truth, protectors of memory, ordinary people who'd done extraordinary things simply by refusing to be silent. The memorial in the valley was expanded to include their names. Not at the center, they would have hated that, but at the edge. A small plaque acknowledging the couple who'd found Caleb's archive and honored his trust. Acknowledging that truth requires courage at every stage, from preservation to discovery to revelation. Sarah Chen retired from journalism at 63, having spent 30 years exposing corruption and giving voice to the voiceless. She became director of the Opal Henderson Institute, carrying forward the work her friends had started. She led tours personally when she could, telling visitors about the couple who'd changed history from a cabin on a cliff. Yuki Tanaka published her final book at 79, a comprehensive history of government displacement projects across 5 countries spanning 8 decades. She dedicated it to Caleb, Merrick, and Opal, who proved that truth outlives those who try to bury it. The Allied Pacific Initiative settlements continued. Children and grandchildren of displaced families received compensation, recognition, acknowledgement. The total reached $8.3 billion across multiple countries. Monuments were erected, history books were rewritten. Universities established research programs. The truth spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, each wave reaching farther than the last. And in Washington, D.C., in the Smithsonian's American History Museum, Caleb Whitmore's metal box sits in a climate-controlled case. Visitors can see the photograph that changed everything, the orders that proved conspiracy, the resignation letter that showed one man's courage. Can understand that history isn't just what happened, but who tells the story and who gets remembered. Beside the box, a placard explains how the documents were discovered twice. Once by Merrick Henderson, fixing a wall in a cabin he'd bought. Once by Smithsonian researchers, following clues Caleb had left in watermarks and buried boxes. How each discovery built on the last, how truth emerged in layers, how persistence and courage and simple decency combined to expose what powerful people wanted hidden. Children pressed their faces to the glass, reading about the hidden corridor and the buried box, about old people who wouldn't give up, about how one person's choice to preserve evidence could echo across 70 years and change the world. Teachers used the story in lessons about integrity, about standing up to power, about why history matters. Ethicists debate the moral calculus of Caleb's decision to stay silent while gathering evidence versus speaking out immediately. Historians analyze the long-term impacts of delayed justice versus no justice at all. But mostly, the story endures because it's fundamentally human. A man who wouldn't let truth die. A couple who wouldn't let injustice stand. Thousands of families who refused to forget, even when the world told them their memories were wrong. Ordinary people making hard choices, fighting impossible fights, believing that truth matters enough to risk everything for it. The cabin still stands on the cliff edge, maintained by the Institute, visited by thousands every year. The hidden corridor remains open, showing where Caleb stored his secrets. The northeast corner foundation stones are marked, explaining what was buried there. The deck where Merrick and Opal sat watching sunsets is preserved, a place for visitors to pause and reflect. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when mist clings to the valley and light angles through pine trees just right, tour guides swear they can feel the presence of the three people buried on that cliff. Not ghosts, nothing so dramatic, just the weight of purpose, the resonance of lives fully lived, the echo of courage that changed everything. Caleb Whitmore spent 40 years protecting truth. Merrick and Opal Henderson spent 7 years revealing it. Together, across death and time and the simple accident of one couple buying a cabin they couldn't afford, they proved something essential about human nature. That some people refuse to let truth die. That ordinary individuals can stand against institutional power and win. That justice delayed isn't always justice denied if someone somewhere keeps fighting for it. That the arc of history bends toward justice not on its own, but because people grab hold and pull with everything they have. And that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. The end. Thank you for watching this incredible story of courage, truth, and justice that spanned 7 decades. If you believe in the power of ordinary people to change the world, hit that subscribe button and click on one of the 2 stories on your screen right now. Because everyone deserves to have their truth heard, their history honored, and their courage recognized. See you in the next one.